Good evening. Tonight we're joined by one of Washington's most respected Iran analysts, Barbara Slavin, Distinguished Fellow at Stimson Center and former Director of the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Ms. Slavin has spent decades covering U.S.-Iran relations from diplomacy to confrontation and has constantly warned about the risks of escalation and the limits of military solutions. At a moment when the Trump administration is claiming progress in the war while offering no clear exit strategy, facing growing domestic backlash and escalating strikes on Iranian infrastructure, her insights are more critical than ever. Barbara, thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
President Trump says the war is nearing completion, yet officials still cannot clearly define what victory looks like. From your perspective, is there a coherent strategy, or are we seeing policy improvisation in real time?
I think it's very much the latter. And, I watched your excellent interview with John Limbert, and I remember something that John always used to say. I think he was quoting Alice in Wonderland. He said, "If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there." And that really, really makes me think of the Trump administration. I think that Donald Trump thought the Iranian regime would fall because of the initial strikes and decapitation. And when that didn't happen, I think he's been improvising ever since.
We've heard multiple and sometimes conflicting objectives: destroying Iran's military, stopping its nuclear program, reopening Hormuz, even regime change. What do you believe is the actual primary objective of this war? Or is there one?
At this point, I think it's simply for the United States to exit this war without losing face. And that's going to be very difficult as long as Iran is able to control traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. We are objectively in a worse situation in many ways than we were before the war started. I mean, Iran will suffer and is suffering enormous damage. But if it has a chokehold over the Strait of Hormuz, it can collect tolls, it can use that money to try to rebuild and eventually rebuild much of the infrastructure that's been destroyed. So the fact that that was not anticipated is just mind-boggling to me.
We've seen a lot of movement overnight, actually, last night. You could say a air bridge between the United States and the Persian Gulf has been very, very busy. And many analysts are suggesting that the Trump administration is on the verge of committing to some sort of special forces movement on the ground on Iranian islands or maybe even an Iranian mainland near the Straits of Hormuz. Do you think that would be a way out for the United States, or would it just bring the United States into a more quagmire kind of war in Iran?
Yeah, I think ground troops are a very risky proposition. At this point, I'm more worried about Trump carrying out his threats to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age by hitting all sorts of energy infrastructure, water desalinization plants. If he carries out those threats, Iran is going to retaliate against its Arab neighbors, and the destruction and chaos is just going to be astronomical. But I mean, if you look at what he's posting on his social media site, it's all fire and brimstone, and my deadline is about to expire, and accept a ceasefire or else. So I think the next 24 hours or so are going to be very tense, and I'm extremely worried that he is going to just make this so much worse without an exit strategy.
You mentioned the Arab neighbors of Iran on the other side of the Persian Gulf. There seems to be a divergence among them. While Qatar is clearly trying to make some space between itself and Washington, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are becoming more involved in the actual war. In fact, the Iranian Foreign Ministry last night provided some material evidence that the UAE is actually engaged in the war with its air force. How important is this rift among the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council, and could this even destabilize the Middle East further than it is, if
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
possible, basically?
at this point, it's very hard to see how, what the alliance structures are going to look like when this is all over. And that includes the GCC, it includes the relations that all these countries have with the United States. I mean, it is interesting. Iran has hit the UAE hardest. And I'm not quite sure what the reason for that is. Maybe it's simply that it's closer and easier, or because the UAE has a peace agreement with Israel, and has been working with the Israelis. I'm not really sure, but the UAE clearly is furious at Iran. The Saudis as well, since they tried to have some sort of reconciliation and restored relations 3 years ago. Um, the problem is, I mean, you hear that there are individuals, leaders in these countries that want to sort of finish off the Islamic Republic once and for all, but I don't see how that can happen. I mean, if anything, we have been really struck by the resilience of the Islamic Republic, the ability of the country to continue to fire missiles and drones at its neighbors, at Israel. And here we are, more than a month into this war, and all the reports that, Iran would run out of these things, those have not been true. And Iran has shot down American planes. So reports that Iran had no, missile defenses or air defenses, that all of this had been decimated, obviously that is untrue. And as we're speaking, there's still an American pilot who is unaccounted for in Iran. So look, we don't know what Trump is planning. I'm sure it's going to be quite devastating, but it seems that the Islamic Republic is prepared to continue to fight. And how the United States could reopen the Strait of Hormuz without Iranian cooperation, I mean, that's going to be very, very difficult to imagine.
You recently described Trump's decision as a cosmic roll of dice. Has there been any pushback by senior generals in the Pentagon or the CIA or, other elements of the state? Or are we now deeper into the uncertainty?
Well, we have seen a number of firings in the Pentagon. We don't know the reason for a lot of them, but it does seem that Pete Hegseth does not like to be contradicted. And he styles himself the Secretary of War, and he's obviously enjoying this. I think one of the most disturbing things to me has been watching, the postings, particularly of Pete Hegseth and also Donald Trump, of bridges being blown up, and this sort of triumphalism at this wanton destruction of infrastructure and wanton killing of individuals. They seem to be enjoying this. This is not the United States of America that I'm accustomed to. The U.S., yes, obviously has a incredibly potent war machine, but not one that took delight in this sort of levels. I mean, not since Vietnam. It's almost like the movie Apocalypse Now. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Bomb them to the Stone Age. That's a comment that General Curtis LeMay made about North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Um, this is alienating, I think, a lot of people in the Pentagon and the intelligence establishment. Certainly, in experienced diplomats, both current and former, are appalled by this language and this behavior. The briefings that Pete Hegseth gives are also appalling. I mean, people are calling him the Secretary of War Crimes because he says that America should go to war without obeying any international norms or rules or regulations. And we must remember that this war started with an accidental attack that killed almost 200 school children in Iran. So it's appalling, and I think there will be hell to pay in this country when this war is over politically for the Trump administration.
I think I myself and many Iranians are kind of bewildered by the language which is being used. Because at the beginning of the war, there were many, many Iranians inside Iran and also in the diaspora who were hoping that the war would bring a quick collapse of the Islamic regime, a regime which had just killed thousands of its own citizens in January, the uprising. And but now they're seeing, a lot of discussion about targeting critical civilian infrastructure, bridges, power plants, economic not centers and whatnot. Is this a sign of desperation, or has President Trump lost any interest in winning the hearts and minds of Iranians? Because initially he was quite interested in having the Iranians alongside him and kind of separating between the regime and the people. But
Yeah.
no longer. He's talking about Iran, sending Iran back to the Stone Age and whatnot. Why do you think this has happened? Is this under the influence of Bibi Netanyahu? Is it under the influence of Pete Hegseth? I mean, I don't know, his crusader mode.
Yeah.
Why do we see this change of tone?
Yeah. Look, I think I understand why so many Iranians are desperate to get rid of this regime. And it's not just the killings in January. I mean, people are still being executed now every day, young people in Iran for participating in those protests. This is an odious regime. I think but the notion that Donald Trump was ever going to embrace human rights or democracy as a cause in Iran, I think was always wishful thinking, frankly, on the part of Iranians, both inside and outside the country. Donald Trump is not a Democrat. Donald Trump is an autocrat. He envies Vladimir Putin. He thinks he did regime change in Venezuela because he got rid of one dictator and put another one in that was willing to do deals with the United States. He is trying to undermine and destroy democracy in the United States and around the world. He supports people like Viktor Orban in Europe. He wants to destroy NATO because European allies have not rushed to help the United States in a war that they had no consultation about, let alone any desire to begin. So you know, it's a terrible thing. But he was never really interested. What he thought was that the demonstrations, the protests in January, the killings would make the Iranian regime somehow more vulnerable to US and Israeli strikes, particularly the decapitation strikes. But that just shows that he didn't understand anything about the Islamic Republic. I mean, this is a system, this is a nizam. It has it has deep roots or tentacles, if you will, in Iranian society after half a century. And you can kill 100 of these clerics and IRGC generals, and there will be others to take their place. They've reached back and brought back, some of the worst characters from the IRGC, Zulqadar and Vahidi. These are people associated with terrorism, with bombings in Argentina against Jewish centers in the 1990s. These are not exactly an improvement on the people that they replace. And then you have an old character, old warhorse like Kalibov, who Trump seems to like. God knows why. I mean, he's been around forever. He's done a million different jobs. He's reportedly quite corrupt. So maybe, Trump thinks he can be the Delcy Rodriguez of Iran, but we're certainly not seeing any indication of that so far. Um, his motives, who knows? I mean, he wants to go down in history as a legendary president. He thought perhaps the Islamic Republic would collapse on his watch, and then he would be known for doing something that no American president had the courage to do before. But there's a reason no American president has done this before, and that's because it is, dare I say, insane to think that the United States can defeat the Islamic Republic from the air, even with commandos. Look what happened to us in Iraq, and we had 150,000 troops there, and allied forces from Europe, from other countries. The US got bogged down and eventually had to basically cut its losses and leave. So I just, Trump doesn't read, he doesn't understand history, he's trapped in old concepts. When he thinks of Iran, I think he thinks about the hostage crisis. It's like he's relitigating 1979 to 1981. And of course, Pete Hegseth is a pathetic character who has sidelined, fired many, many professional military people who I'm sure told him that this was not a war that the US should start.
The Iranian regime in Iran is counting on mounting political pressure in the United States on President Trump. To what extent can domestic politics shape battlefield decisions in this administration?
Well, we have a ways to wait until our November elections, unfortunately. But I think even among the Republican members of Congress, there is increasing consternation about this war, the price tag. It's costing $1 billion a day. Trump has now unveiled an astronomical demand for a new Pentagon budget, cutting all kinds of social programs, education, healthcare, things that Americans really care about. So I think there's mounting consternation, and that this will have an impact on him at some point. I mean, he said this war would go on 4 to 6 weeks. We're almost there. So at some point, I do think he is going to have to declare victory and end the war. How he does that with the Strait of Hormuz still closed is going to be difficult. And I see that the Iranians are cutting deals now with various countries. They're letting Iraqi oil out now. They're making deals with Pakistanis and Indians and others, but they're not letting oil go through from countries that are affiliated with the United States or Israel. Anyway, it's going to be hard for him to spin this, but he's proven capable of talking out of both sides of his mouth at once. So at some point, I think he will feel the pressure. We have gasoline now well over $4 a gallon, and this is going to cause a real drag on the economy. His poll numbers are in the mid-low 30s now. He's losing even young white men who supported him in the presidential election. So there will be an impact. It's just how long will it take and how much more damage will he do? How much more damage will Iran do to its neighbors, to Israel, and to the international economy before this is over?
You've argued that Iran is, or the Islamic Republic is likely to outlast this confrontation. What would that mean for US policy if the regime survives intact? And as you mentioned, the regime is now made up of the worst elements of the regime, people with really dark pasts and people who are likely to take their revenge on the Iranian people when the war is over. They're even executing protesters during the war, which is like crazy.
Yeah.
So, but how would that impact US standing in the world?
Well, I think US standing in the world has already deteriorated significantly since Donald Trump came in. I mean, he picks fights with our traditional allies. He is rude and crude. The things that he says about foreign leaders who have supported him are beyond embarrassing. The degree of corruption in the United States now. I mean, his family is making money off this war. They have his sons have interests in companies that manufacture weapons that are being provided, that are being sold to the Arab countries. His association with the Israelis is also increasingly controversial. Now, I don't blame Bibi Netanyahu for this war. I blame Donald Trump. He's the one who agreed to do it. But it's increasing anti-Semitism in the country. Very dangerous things that have been unleashed by this president. So I'm very worried about my own, country and the course of events here, as much as I feel horrible for the Iranian people and what they're going through now and what they've been going through, frankly, for 47 years. I was mentioning to you before we started, I was rereading some chapters in a book I wrote 20 years ago. And, people's complaints about the regime and the inability of the regime to reform itself, even though there were people who tried and tried very, very hard to change the nature of the regime. There's plenty of blame to go around, frankly, for everyone that we are where we are. But if the war ends with this regime still there, controlling the Strait of Hormuz, with 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium still unaccounted for, I mean, one can argue that we are in a much worse situation than we were before the war started. And I don't know how Trump spins that.
Are we drifting into a prolonged, low intensity conflict with no clear endpoint, something the US historically struggles to exit?
It's possible. I mean, Trump started this. He's going to have to decide how to end it. I mean, perhaps after, there has been massive additional destruction, he will then declare victory. He will tally up all the things he has destroyed in Iran and say that's victory. But it won't be. And people keep saying, that he's the Teflon president, nothing ever sticks. But when you look at all the cumulative scandals, he's just dismissed his attorney general who couldn't protect him from the Epstein files investigation. We have, of course, the scandal over the immigration over enforcement and the human rights atrocities that have been committed against immigrants with no criminal records, sometimes even American citizens being killed. This is beginning to stick to him. And, I don't know how, I mean, assuming the House of Representatives changes hands in November, it's likely that he will be impeached for a third time. And many of his officials will be impeached, those that are still in office. So it's a really dreadful record. And again, I mean, Iranians should not put their faith in outside forces to deliver them from their evil regime. This is something that has to be done from within somehow, as hard as it is. And I think that the regime, although it may survive this war, will be weakened. I mean, after all, it is the foreign policies of this system that has put Iran in the crosshairs of Israel and the United States for 47 years. It is the death to Israel chants. It is the support for groups like Hamas and Hezbollah that have put Iran in this situation. And so at some point, I think the regime will have to recalibrate and shift these policies. Certainly, we see that it's already stopped trying to enforce hijab, for example, for women, this sort of thing. It's going to need to gain some sort of base beyond a very, very narrow sliver of Iranian society that, identifies with the regime and depends on the regime. So, I'm not giving up hope for this country. I mean, Iran had the first elected parliament in the Middle East. It had Mohammad Mossadegh. It had the revolution, which was fought for good reasons, even though it was hijacked by Ayatollah Khomeini and his ilk. It had the reform movement, which was genuine. It had the green movement. It had women, life, freedom. So it's going to happen at some point. But I just hope that outside powers, get their fingers off Iran because they're only making things worse.
And final question, if you had to map it out, what are the best case scenarios and the worst case scenario from here?
Well, the best case scenario is that Trump declares victory and stops the war, and that Iran works out some sort of arrangement with the United States so that it's not going to be attacked again in 6 months, and that the regime begins to try to address not just the reconstruction that's going to be necessary, but that it tries to build some bridges to Iranian society, which have been so badly broken. The worst case scenario is that this goes on and on. Thousands more people die, billions more in infrastructure is destroyed, the price of oil and other commodities skyrockets, and we go into a global recession that will hurt all of humanity. That's the worst case.
Absolutely, very bleak outlook. Barbara, thank you very much for your time and for sharing such clear and thoughtful insights with us at such a critical moment. We truly appreciate it. Until next time, goodbye.